Welcome to Calm Coding. This time we're looking into cybersecurity, which, as you know, is always changing.
Definitely seems like the news is never slow on that front.
Yeah, you sent over a ton of really interesting articles about recent attacks and trends.
Yep.
And some pretty big developments, too.
Uh-huh.
Think we can make sense of it all?
I think so. Let's give it a shot.
Okay, great. Well, it seems like there's a mix of good and bad news out there.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Like, on the one hand, law enforcement is taking down ransomware groups, which is a huge win.
For sure.
But then at the same time, we're seeing this rise in state-sponsored hacking,
Right.
with everyone from governments to individual developers ending up as targets.
Yep, it's a bit of a tug of war.
That's a good way to put it. So let's start with a win, though, okay? Tell me about the takedown of the 8base Ransomware group.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
It seems like it was a pretty big deal.
It was, and not just some local thing either. This was a huge international effort.
Oh, wow.
Arrests were made in Thailand, but the investigations spanned the U.S., Europe, Asia.
Really?
Yeah, it shows you how connected cybercrime has become these days.
That's wild. I mean, it really is a global issue then.
It is. It's no longer just one country's problem.
And it sounds like 8base wasn't exactly small time either.
No, they were going after some pretty major players.
Yeah, like Nidec Corporation, right?
Uh-huh. They stole thousands of confidential files.
Wow.
Even the United Nations was hit.
What?
Yeah, with a custom version of the Phobos ransomware.
It's scary how advanced this stuff is getting.
It is, and the impact is huge. Through this operation that they called Operation Phobos 8, authorities were able to help over 200 victims
Wow.
in the UK alone.
That's incredible. It really gives you a sense of the scale of these operations.
Yeah, and how much potential there is for destruction.
So cracking down on these groups is super important.
Definitely.
But then I read about the struggles against groups like Lockbit, and it makes it seem like every time we take one group down, another one pops up.
It's true. It does feel a little like whack-a-mole sometimes,
Yeah.
but it's a constant arms race. And even though the amount of money paid in ransomware attacks is actually down this year,
Oh, really?
it dropped from $1.25 billion in 2023 to $813.55 million.
In 2024.
Yeah, but I mean, that's still a ton of money.
It is.
That's flowing to cyber criminals.
Yeah, that's crazy. So the fight's definitely not over.
Not even close.
And the financial cost is only part of the problem, right? There's also the disruption to businesses and the fact that sensitive data is getting compromised.
Exactly. Speaking of which, one article he sent was about Apple
Oh, yeah.
issuing a critical update for iPhones and iPads. They were patching a vulnerability in their USB restricted mode,
Right.
which is supposed to stop data transfer through the port after an error of being locked.
Okay.
But apparently there was a way to bypass this security feature.
Uh-oh.
And Apple being Apple, they're usually super tight-lipped about security updates.
Yeah.
But this time they actually said that this vulnerability had probably been used in a targeted attack.
Really?
Yeah, and their wording was interesting. They said a sophisticated attack against specific targeted individuals.
Specific targeted individuals. It sounds like they're talking about government snooping, right?
That's what a lot of people are thinking. It definitely reopens that whole privacy versus security debate.
Yeah. Where do we draw the line between allowing governments access for investigations, but also making sure that individual privacy is protected?
Exactly. It's a tricky one.
It is. And it's not just our phones that are at stake either.
Right.
We also have Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, or HPE,
Okay.
notifying people about the 2023 Midnight Blizzard attack.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this was carried out by that Russian state-sponsored group known as Cozy Bear,
Or Nobelium.
or Nobelium. That's right. It's interesting, though, that they're just notifying people now,
Right.
over a year later.
Yeah, it seems like they only recently figured out just how much data was actually stolen.
Oh, no.
And it's bad. We're talking social security numbers, driver's license info, even credit card numbers.
Oof, that's a nightmare.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder about the long-term consequences of these kinds of attacks.
It does, especially since HPE claims there was no material impact to their operations. So not even tech giants are immune to this stuff.
Nope.
It's scary to think about how secure any of our data really is.
It is. It highlights how important vigilance is at every level.
Definitely. And it's not just big corporations that are being targeted.
Right.
There's also that article you said about Trimble. They're the software vendor for local governments and utilities. And that one really caught my eye because those are services that we all rely on.
Absolutely. They're essential.
And it turns out that Trimble found a vulnerability in their Cityworks product.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was being exploited to launch what are called remote code execution attacks.
Oh, wow.
and deploy something called Cobalt Strike beacons on servers.
Okay, so Cobalt Strike is basically like a toolkit that hackers use
Hmm.
to take over entire networks.
Oh boy, that doesn't sound good.
No, not at all. I mean, imagine if hackers got control of critical infrastructure systems.
Like power grids.
Yeah, or transportation or emergency services, the disruption would be massive.
It's a scary thought.
It is. It just shows how important constant vigilance is, and not just for the big organizations, but also for the software vendors they're working with.
It feels like the more connected we are, the more vulnerable we become.
That's true, and it makes you think about all the software that we use every day,
Yeah,
and whether we're doing enough to protect ourselves.
definitely. And then there are those financially motivated attacks, like the one carried out by the North Korean Lazarus Group.
Oh, yeah.
They targeted software and Web3 developers using this undetectable malware.
That one was pretty sneaky. They hid the malware in GitHub repositories and NPM packages.
Really?
Yeah, so it was basically disguised as legitimate code.
That's so devious.
It is, and once the code was executed, it would scan for cryptocurrency wallets
Oh, no.
and even mess with browser settings to steal money.
So they're basically using the developer's own tools against them.
Exactly. It's a super targeted attack aimed at a very specific community.
That's wild. And it shows how state-sponsored hacking isn't always about spying or disruption.
Right.
Sometimes it's about money.
Uh-huh. Especially in the crypto space, since it's still relatively new.
Yeah, and maybe a little more vulnerable.
Possibly. It's a good reminder that cyber threats can come from anywhere.
Yeah.
And take a lot of different forms.
It's definitely not just about protecting your computer from viruses anymore.
No, it's much bigger than that. We need to understand the whole landscape of threats.
Right.
And adapt our security practices accordingly.
I think you're absolutely right.
I do too. Yeah, it really is. And you know what strikes me about all this?
What's that?
Cybersecurity, it's not just about protecting our devices anymore.
You're right. It does feel much bigger.
It is. It's about protecting our whole way of life.
Hmm.
Think about how much we depend on technology now.
Oh, totally.
For everything. Communication, commerce, all of our essential services.
Like critical infrastructure.
Exactly. If those systems go down, the impacts are felt everywhere.
Across society.
Exactly. A cyber attack on a power grid or a transportation system.
Or a financial institution.
Right. Could have devastating consequences.
It's scary to think about.
It is. And with state-sponsored hacking on the rise.
Right.
And potentially driven by things beyond just money.
Yeah.
The stakes are higher than ever.
So what can we do? It feels like such a massive problem.
It is a complex challenge, but there are things we can do both individually and collectively.
Okay, so what should we be doing? Where do we even start?
Well, for starters, we need to prioritize cybersecurity education.
Okay.
And awareness. People need to understand the risks.
Right.
How to protect themselves, what to do if they do get attacked.
So knowledge is power. The more we know, the better we can defend ourselves.
Exactly. And it's not just about technical knowledge either.
Oh, okay.
It's about having good digital hygiene habits, strong passwords, being aware of phishing emails.
Keeping software up to date.
Right, all the things we hear all the time but can be easy to forget about.
Yeah, we've all been there hitting that remind me later button on those software updates.
I know. But honestly, those simple steps can make a huge difference.
That's good to know. But it's not just about individual responsibility, right?
Right, organizations have a crucial role to play too.
Okay, so things like investing in better security systems.
Yeah, that's a given, but it goes beyond that too. It's about having a whole cybersecurity strategy in place.
What does that actually look like?
Well, you need risk assessment, vulnerability management, incident response planning,
Wow.
employee training.
Okay, so you're talking about a culture of cybersecurity.
Right, awareness and preparedness.
Got it. So it's an ongoing process, not just a one-time fix.
Exactly, and it requires collaboration.
Between who?
Everyone, governments, businesses, cybersecurity professionals, individuals. We all need to be working together, sharing information about threats, vulnerabilities, best practices.
So cybersecurity is a team sport.
Exactly. We need to break down silos
Mm-hmm.
and share information openly and transparently. Because cybersecurity is a global issue. It affects all of us.
Reading these articles, it's clear that state-sponsored hacking is a big concern.
It really is. And it seems like more and more countries are getting involved. Yeah, it's a growing trend and a concerning one for a few reasons.
Like what?
Well, state-sponsored hackers usually have way more resources than your average cyber criminal.
Oh, I bet.
And they have access to much more sophisticated tools.
So they're operating on a whole other level.
You could say that, and their motives can be hard to figure out.
Yeah, like are they spying? Are they trying to disrupt things? Is it both?
Right. It's hard to predict what they'll do next.
And that unpredictability makes them even more dangerous.
Exactly. It adds this whole other layer of complexity to cybersecurity. We're not just dealing with opportunistic criminals anymore.
Right.
We're dealing with nation states with their own agendas.
It's like cyber warfare playing out in real life.
In a way it is, and it's something we need to be prepared for. We need strong defenses,
Right.
but also a plan for what to do if we are attacked.
That makes sense. One article mentioned Salt Typhoon,
Oh, yeah.
which is a Chinese state-sponsored hacking group targeting ISP and
Universities,
telecoms.
they've been busy lately exploiting vulnerabilities in Cisco devices.
Oh, wow.
To get into sensitive networks, we don't really know what their end game is.
Right.
But anytime you see critical infrastructure being targeted, it's not a good sign.
No, it's not. It's a scary reminder that these threats are real,
Mm-hmm.
and they're constantly evolving. What can regular people do to protect themselves against these kinds of attacks?
It can feel overwhelming, but there are things you can do.
Okay.
Start by making sure your router and your other devices are running the latest software updates.
Okay.
A lot of routers have known vulnerabilities that hackers can take advantage of.
I'll admit I'm guilty of ignoring those update reminders sometimes.
Yeah, we all do it. But in this case, it's really worth taking the time to update.
Okay.
You can also check your router settings, make sure you have a strong password,
Okay.
and that you've disabled any features you don't actually need. It's all about making yourself less of a target.
Right. What about using a VPN? Would that help?
A VPN can definitely add an extra layer of security, especially when you're using public Wi-Fi.
Okay.
It encrypts your internet traffic, so it's harder for hackers to intercept your data.
That makes sense. Any other tips for staying safe online? It feels like there are dangers everywhere.
Just be mindful of what you share online, especially on social media.
Oh, yeah.
Hackers can use that information to target you with phishing scams or other attacks, so think twice before posting those vacation photos.
Or detail status updates.
Exactly. A little digital discretion goes a long way.
That's a good point. And I guess always be wary of suspicious emails or links.
Absolutely. If something looks fishy, don't click on it. It's better to be safe than sorry.
Okay, I can do that. It's a lot to keep in mind, but it seems like essential knowledge these days.
It is. Your digital security is worth it.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive: ransomware, state-sponsored hacking vulnerabilities, best practices. It's a lot to process. So what are your main takeaways from all this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that cybersecurity is always evolving. The threats are constantly changing, so we need to be adaptable and proactive to stay ahead of them.
That sounds like a call to action. What can our listeners do today to improve their cybersecurity?
Just take a few minutes to review your security practices. Make sure your passwords are strong and unique.
Right.
That you're using two-factor authentication whenever you can.
Okay.
And that you're keeping your software up to date. These are simple steps, but they can make a big difference.
Those are good starting points. What if someone needs help beyond that? Where can people go for more guidance?
Don't be afraid to ask for help. There are a ton of resources online, including organizations like the National Cybersecurity Alliance. They offer great information and guidance.
Awesome knowledge is key. The more we know, the better prepared we'll be.
Absolutely. The more you understand about the threats and how to protect yourself, the better off you'll be.
Thanks for all this insight, Katie. Any final thoughts before we move on to our next segment?
Just remember, cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility. We all have a role to play in keeping ourselves and our communities safe online.
Well said. Now let's shift gears a bit and look at some specific incidents and trends. You mentioned the North Korean Lazarus Group earlier. What makes them so dangerous?
Oh, the Lazarus Group. They're a highly sophisticated, state-sponsored hacking group.
Okay.
And they're well-funded, too.
Oh, boy.
They have a history of really high-profile attacks.
Oh, yeah? Like what?
Well, they were behind the Sony Pictures hack back in 2014.
Oh, wow.
And the WannaCry ransomware attack in 2017.
Yeah, those were huge.
Those were not small-time operations.
So what do they focus on these days?
It seems like they're shifting more towards financial gain,
Okay.
which aligns with that growing trend we were talking about earlier.
Right.
One article mentioned that they're targeting software and Web3 developers with that undetectable malware.
It's interesting that they're targeting a specific community like that.
Yeah, it's a very strategic approach. They're basically hijacking the supply chain,
Oh, wow.
embedding malware in legitimate software that then gets distributed to unsuspecting users.
And once it's installed.
They can do all sorts of things: steal cryptocurrency-sensitive data, even give the hackers control of the device.
So it's a stealthy and potentially really damaging attack?
Exactly. So developers need to be extra careful.
What can they do to protect themselves?
Awareness is key. The Lazarus Group uses really sophisticated techniques to hide their malware. So developers need to be really vigilant, scrutinize any code you're downloading,
Okay.
or integrating into your projects. Don't just blindly trust any source.
No matter how legitimate it seems.
Exactly. Due diligence is paramount.
Got it. And what if you're working with open source software?
If you're working with open source software, stick to well-established and reputable projects.
Okay.
There's strength in numbers and a track record of security there.
That makes sense. Any other advice for developers looking to up their security game?
Secure coding practices are essential. Things like validating user input, sanitizing data,
Okay.
using encryption to protect sensitive information.
So building security into the software from the ground up.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just the code, too. Secure your development environment.
Okay.
These strong passwords and two-factor authentication for everything. It's all about layers of protection.
It sounds like a lot to manage, but the stakes are clearly high.
They are. The consequences of a successful cyber attack can be devastating.
Yeah.
Both for the developer and their users, it's all about risk management, weighing the costs of security measures against the potential costs of a breach.
And these days, the cost of a breach can be astronomical.
Oh, absolutely. Both financially and reputationally.
So you're saying prevention is better than cure?
Way better?
Okay, you mentioned that state-sponsored hacking is becoming more common.
Mm-hmm.
Besides North Korea, what other countries are active in this space?
Well, we've seen a lot of activity from Russia,
Okay.
China, and Iran.
So are they all after the same thing?
It really depends on the country and then the attack itself.
Hmm.
Espionage, political influence, economic disruption, even military advantage.
It's a lot.
It's a really complex web of objectives.
So it's a mix of traditional espionage and this new kind of cyber warfare,
Right, and the lines are getting blurrier and blurrier.
making it harder to figure out what's going on.
And harder to defend against.
Can you give us some examples of attacks by these countries?
Sure. In 2020, the U.S. government accused Russian hackers of breaching SolarWinds,
Oh, yeah.
which is a big IT software company.
Mm-hmm.
And they used that access to get into the networks of several government agencies
Wow.
and private companies.
Yeah, that was a major incident.
It was. It really exposed vulnerabilities in both the public and private sectors.
And what about China?
Chinese hackers have been linked to all sorts of attacks, intellectual property theft,
Okay.
espionage against government and military targets,
Hmm.
even attacks on dissidents and human rights activists. They have a broad reach,
Yeah.
and their motives can be really complex.
And what about Iran?
Iranian hackers have been known to target critical infrastructure,
Okay.
like energy companies and financial institutions. They've also been accused of attacking dissidents and political opponents.
It's a pretty concerning picture of the cyber landscape.
It is, and it's likely to get even more complicated as technology keeps advancing,
Hmm.
and the line between the physical and digital worlds gets even blurrier.
It feels overwhelming. What can we do to protect ourselves from state-sponsored hackers? Are we just sitting ducks?
Absolutely not. The first step is awareness.
Okay.
We need to understand the threats, the motives, and the tactics.
And then what practical steps can we take?
A lot of the same precautions that apply to regular criminals also apply to state-sponsored actors.
Okay.
Strong passwords, being careful about phishing emails, keeping your software up to date,
Right?
using a VPN when you're on public Wi-Fi. These are all foundational steps to online safety.
So the basics are still relevant, even against these more sophisticated threats.
Absolutely. And remember, no one is immune. Individuals, businesses, governments, we're all potential targets.
That's sobering. Any final words of wisdom?
Stay vigilant and informed. Cybersecurity is constantly changing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to stay up to date on the latest threats and best practices. Don't be afraid to ask for help or guidance.
Right.
There are a lot of resources available online and through organizations like the National Cybersecurity Alliance.
Great advice. Now let's shift our focus to the impact of these attacks. We've talked about the financial costs, but what other consequences are there?
Well, beyond the financial impact, cyber attacks can also really damage reputation.
Okay.
Trust and even national security, these are often the hidden costs. They're harder to quantify,
Right.
but they're just as important.
Can you give us some examples of these less obvious consequences?
Sure, if a company has a data breach, it can really damage their reputation and erode customer trust.
Okay.
And that can lead to lost business, decreased revenue, and even legal action.
Yeah.
The ripple effects can go on and on.
And how do these attacks affect national security?
Well, they can be used to steal sensitive information,
Right.
disrupt critical infrastructure,
Mm-hmm.
or even influence elections.
Wow.
In some cases, they can even cause physical damage or loss of life.
It's kind of hard to believe that.
I know, but the stakes are that high.
It's easy to think of cyber attacks as these abstract events,
Yeah,
but the real-world implications can be huge.
they can be, and that's why it's so important to treat cybersecurity as a national priority
Right.
and invest in the resources and expertise we need to defend ourselves. It's not just about technology.
It's about national security.
Exactly. You mentioned critical infrastructure earlier. Can you give us some specific examples of what could be targeted? Critical infrastructure is basically anything essential to the functioning of society.
Okay.
So power grids, transportation systems, communication, networks, financial institutions, healthcare facilities, all of these are potential targets.
So an attack on any one of these systems could have a big impact on our daily lives.
Absolutely. Think about it. An attack on a power grid could cause blackouts, disrupt transportation,
Yeah,
even lead to food shortages. An attack on a financial institution could disrupt the economy,
right.
cause panic, erode confidence in the financial system.
It sounds like we're really vulnerable to these attacks. Is there anything we can do to reduce the risks?
We are vulnerable, but we're not helpless. We need to invest in better security for our critical infrastructure.
Like what kinds of things?
Intrusion detection systems, firewalls, encryption. We also need to have better incident response plans.
Okay, so we can react quickly if something does happen.
Right. So it's a combination of proactive measures
Hmm.
and having a solid plan in place if things go wrong.
Got it. And what about the role of the government?
The government has a key role to play. They need to set standards, provide guidance,
Hmm.
invest in research and development. They also need to work with the private sector to share information
Right.
and coordinate responses. It's a partnership.
Okay, so it's a collaborative effort, just like we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. Cybersecurity is a shared responsibility.
Okay, now let's talk about some of the challenges in cybersecurity. What are some of the biggest hurdles we need to overcome?
One of the biggest challenges is just the speed at which technology is changing.
Right.
The threats are always evolving, so it's really hard to keep up.
It's like trying to hit a moving target.
Exactly. And it's not just the technology itself, it's also about how we use it.
Hmm.
As we become more reliant on technology, we also become more vulnerable. It's a double-edged sword.
What are some of the other challenges we're facing?
Another big one is the shortage of skilled cybersecurity professionals.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we need more people who can design, implement, and manage secure systems.
Okay.
But the demand far outweighs the supply.
So it's a workforce problem as much as a technology problem.
Exactly. And it's a global problem. We just don't have enough qualified people to fill all the open cybersecurity positions.
Wow. So how do we address this shortage?
Well, we need to invest in education and training programs,
Okay.
make cybersecurity a more attractive career path.
By offering competitive salaries.
Right, competitive salaries and benefits. And we need to inspire the next generation of cyber defenders.
It's about making cybersecurity a desirable and accessible career.
Exactly. And another big challenge, and this is a tricky one, is the lack of international cooperation.
What do you mean?
Cybercrime is a global problem,
Right.
but we're still trying to address it with this patchwork of national laws and regulations.
It's a fragmented approach.
Exactly. We need a more coordinated global response to match the global nature of the threat.
So we need to work together.
Yes, we need to work together to share information, develop common standards, and enforce laws against cybercriminals. It's a tall order,
Yeah, it sounds like it.
but it's essential if we want to be effective in combating cybercrime.
Well, you've given us a lot to consider, Katie. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Just remember, cybersecurity is a journey, not a destination. We need to be constantly learning,
Right.
adapting, and improving our defenses. And above all, we need to remember that we're in this together. Cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility.
So collaboration's key. We need to be proactive. But how do we stay ahead of the curve with all these threats popping up left and right?
It can feel overwhelming, for sure. I mean, the sheer volume of attacks and how complex they are. But one thing that's super effective is threat intelligence.
Threat intelligence sounds kind of like something out of a spy movie.
Right. It's basically cybersecurity detective work.
Okay, so what is it exactly?
It's the process of gathering information about threats, then analyzing it and sharing it.
So like figuring out who the bad guys are, what their goals are, how they operate.
Exactly, like profiling, but for cybercriminals.
Okay, I like it. So then you can use that knowledge to protect yourself.
Exactly.
Makes sense. But where do you even get that kind of information from?
It comes from all over: government agencies, security researchers, private companies, even open source intelligence. It all contributes.
So it's like putting a puzzle together.
Exactly. You take bits and pieces from everywhere and then you analyze it all.
Right.
To get the big picture, once you know what the threat landscape looks like, you can start building proactive defenses.
So it's not just about reacting to attacks after they've already happened.
Nope. It's about anticipating them and taking steps to stop them before they even start.
I like that approach a lot. But how does that work in practice? How do you actually use threat intelligence to make things more secure?
Well, for one thing, you can use it to find and patch vulnerabilities.
Okay.
If you know that a certain group is targeting a specific weakness in a system, you can fix it before they have a chance to exploit it.
So you're staying one step ahead.
Precisely. Threat intelligence can also help you develop intrusion detection rules.
What are those?
They're basically filters that scan your network for suspicious activity.
So like setting up alarms to catch intruders.
Exactly. If you know that a certain type of malware is being used in attacks,
Mm-hmm.
you can create a rule to detect it and block it.
So it's like a custom security system based on the specific threats you're facing.
That's a great way to put it. You can even use threat intelligence to train your employees.
Oh, right.
Like if there's a phishing scam going around,
Uh-huh.
you can warn everyone and teach them how to avoid falling for it.
So it's all about being proactive and informed and prepared.
Exactly, what gives you the power to make smart decisions about your security.
This all sounds really important, but is it something that only big companies can do? I mean, I don't have a whole security team at my disposal.
Not at all. There are resources out there that can help smaller organizations and even individuals get started with threat intelligence.
Oh, that's good to know. Where should people start? Where can they learn more?
There are a lot of great websites and blogs that cover cybersecurity news and trends. You can also find a ton of information on the websites of government agencies.
Like which ones?
The Department of Homeland Security and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency are good places to start.
Okay, what about tools? Are there any tools that can help gather and analyze threat intelligence?
Oh yeah, there are tons of tools out there, both commercial and open source.
Okay, give me some examples.
Some popular commercial options include Splunk Alien Vault and Anomaly.
Okay.
On the open source side, you have the Hive, MSP, and Security Onion.
That's a lot to choose from. How do you know which ones are right for you?
It depends on your needs and your budget.
Okay.
Commercial tools tend to have more features and better support, but they can be pricey.
Right.
Open source tools are usually free, but they might require a bit more technical expertise to set up.
So it's a trade-off.
It is, but the good news is that there are options for everyone.
Before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, the debate around government access to personal devices.
Yeah, the encryption debate, it's a tough one with strong arguments on both sides.
Right, law enforcement says they need access to encrypted devices to solve crimes and stop terrorism. They say criminals and terrorists are using encryption more and more, making it harder to catch them.
And that's a valid concern. On the other hand, you have privacy advocates
Right?
who argue that giving the government access to our devices would create a backdoor that could be exploited by hackers.
Or even by the government itself.
Exactly. It's a classic struggle between security and privacy.
It really is. Where do you land on this?
It's a tough one. I see both sides. I get why law enforcement needs the tools to do their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also worried about what could happen if the government has unlimited access to our personal data.
It doesn't seem like there's an easy answer.
There isn't. It's a complex issue with huge implications. It's something we need to discuss and debate as a society.
You're right. We need to find a balance that keeps us safe, but also protect our freedoms.
I agree.
Well, we've covered a ton of ground today. Everything from ransomware to state-sponsored hacking, vulnerabilities, best practices.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole encryption debate, it's clear that cybersecurity is a multifaceted and constantly changing world.
It is. And I hope that our listeners now have a better understanding of the threats out there,
Yeah.
the importance of being proactive, and the need for vigilance and awareness.
I think you've given us a lot to think about and some really practical advice that we can all use. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us, Katie.
My pleasure, Cody.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into cybersecurity. Stay safe, stay informed, and remember, cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. We're all in this together. 66 level.